이번 영상에서는 셀레스티아의 COO이신 닉 화이트님을 직접 인터뷰했습니다. 영상에 앞서 바쁘신 일정에도 흔쾌히 인터뷰에 응해주신 닉 화이트님께 진심으로 감사드립니다. 제가 평소에는 제 영상에 좋아요를 눌러달라고 부탁을 잘 드리지 않지만 이번 영상을 통해서 다른 의미 있는 프로젝트들의 설립자들에게 직접 인터뷰할 기회를 늘리기 위해서 좋아요와 아래에 있는 하이프 클릭 부탁드리겠습니다. 특히 셀레스티아 코인을 보유하고 계신다면 아직 셀레스티아를 잘 모르는 투자자들에게 프로젝트를 알리는 데 도움이 될 것 같습니다. 인터뷰 내용이 길어서 전체 인터뷰를 총 4개로 잘라서 업로드할 예정입니다. 가장 먼저 모듈러 체인과 셀레스티아 체인이 무엇인지, 왜 이러한 블록체인 디자인이 필요한지에 대해서 알아봅니다. 두 번째 영상에서는 셀레스티아 체인의 특성과 스마트 컨트렉트 레이어의 한계에 대해서 닉 화이트님의 관점을 들어보실 수 있습니다. 세 번째 영상에서는 크립토 트위터 내에서 쉽게 찾아볼 수 있는 셀레스티아에 관련된 루머에 대해서 직접 질문을 해보았습니다. 재단의 관계자들이 모두 코인을 팔았는지, 현재 낮은 매출에 대한 문제를 어떻게 해결을 할 수 있을지에 대한 대답을 직접 들어보실 수 있습니다. 마지막 네 번째 영상에서는 셀레스티아와 크립토 산업의 미래에 대한 닉 화이트님의 생각을 들어보실 수 있습니다. Before we talk about anything, I need to say a few things. Most of my subscribers know that I'm a big believer of Celestia, and I think Celestia team is fighting the good fight. But there can be new people watching my video for the first time. So full disclosure, I own Celestia token TIA. I might be biased, so take it with a grain of salt. The reason I asked Nick to come on the pod was I made many videos about Celestia on my channel, but I think it's much better to bring someone who can actually explain what Celestia is and why it is so important. Personally, I believe that it can reshape the blockchain industry in the future. Thanks for coming on the pod, Nick.
Yeah, thanks, Kitty. I'm excited to talk. I've been seeing your tweets and then recently discovered your YouTube channel and very impressed at your content, and also you are one of the few people who really understand Celestia, it seems, what we're building, because I think maybe we need to do a better job of explaining it.
That's the reason,
Yeah.
So before we set the stage for Celestia, could you tell us who you are and how you got involved in blockchain?
Yeah, so I'm Nick White. I went to Stanford and studied electrical engineering and computer science, but actually was more focused on AI than crypto. I didn't take any crypto courses. And then after I graduated, and I was working in the AI industry, I found out about blockchain and crypto and sort of fell down the rabbit hole and decided that I wanted to switch industries and go full-time on crypto, because I felt that blockchain was a completely new way for humanity to coordinate and enabled us to build systems that are like incorruptible in nature, and kind of, you know, there's so many things that society relies on where the person who controls that system has undue influence, and there's a lot of things that I think would be better off if society could put them outside of the control of any individual, whether that's a politician or even a businessman. And it just was something that seemed so beautiful, like creating a free market for not only money, but also like coordination and all these services online, like that was native to the internet. And so I joined the space full time in 2018, focusing on scalability, because I felt that in order for blockchains to actually work and for all these potential ideas to come to fruition, we needed the underlying infrastructure to be fast enough, and not just fast enough, but flexible enough to support, mainstream adoption. And so the first project I built was I co-founded a layer one called Harmony, which did sharding and proof of stake back when those were pretty innovative ideas. And then in 2020, around September, I read the Lazy Ledger white paper. And the Lazy Ledger white paper is essentially the Celestia white paper before we rebranded. And the white paper totally blew my mind. It was the most exciting thing that I'd read since the Bitcoin and Ethereum white papers themselves. And I couldn't sleep because I was so excited by the idea. Because to me, it was like, okay, this is the answer. Like everyone was trying to figure out, how do we scale blockchains? How do we build what's the right architecture for a layer one? And then I felt like that was just the answer. Like once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. And so I reached out to Mustafa, who was the author of the paper. We chatted, and then eventually ended up joining the team very early on, like early 2021. And so I've been building Celestia since then. So it's been about 4.5 years.
So what is modular blockchain, and how is it different from smart contract layers like Solana, Sui, and Aptos?
Great place to start. So yeah, Celestia is what I would call the first modular layer one blockchain.
Yes.
And what, the key word there is, everyone knows what a layer one is, I think, that's listening to this podcast, right? It's
Yes.
the base layer on which people build applications. But so the active important word there is modular. What does modular mean? And modular in this case means that Celestia intentionally does less than other layer ones. Namely, it does not do execution, meaning there's actually no smart contracts. There's no virtual machine, no like EVM. There's no computation that happens on chain on Celestia. All of that execution and computation, smart contracts, that stuff is meant to live and be implemented as rollups or layer twos. And Celestia is actually just pure block space, meaning it still produces the raw ingredient that any decentralized application needs to function, but it doesn't actually impose any constraints on what that block space does or how it's used. And this is, this modularity is actually a huge unlock for two reasons. One is what I just said, which is it's super flexible. So like if you take it's kind of the difference between like let's say you had a computer and it already had an operating system installed on it, like it was already had Windows on it. Well, you couldn't run any Mac apps, right? Or let's say you wanted to write your own operating system. Like Linux didn't exist, and you had a community wanted to build like this new operating system, Linux, because it would be super useful for certain things. You wouldn't be able to touch that part of the computer. The computer only would expose, the topmost layer for you to actually interact with, and that's kind of what a monolithic blockchain is. So Ethereum and Solana and basically every other layer one that exists today is monolithic. It already has the operating system installed. It already defines what kind of execution, what kind of smart contracts and like business logic it supports. And then so you're kind of limited as a developer, you're kind of like stuck within this box, right? And it's not just the execution environment. It's also, it defines things like sequencing, like who gets to order your transactions, your RPCs, the wallets, how users interact with the chain. All these things are already baked in a monolithic blockchain. So flexibility is a huge one. The other thing that modular unlocks is scalability. So because Celestia doesn't do execution, it just does block space. It turns out that that's a very, very much simpler thing to scale than a monolithic blockchain's scaling. And so Celestia has a very aggressive, and there's also, by the way, an invention of a new cryptographic primitive called data availability sampling that enables this especially like really, really hyperscale type of throughput that Celestia can do uniquely. And we could talk about that. It's kind of a bit more of a technical rabbit hole, but the idea is essentially, for example, Celestia is about to launch an upgrade called Matcha. And once that's live, the maximum throughput capacity of of Celestia will be 64 times the throughput of Solana today. And that's just also just the start. Like, we're only scratching the surface of the kind of throughput Celestia can do. And the reason that's important, both the speed and the sort of like flexibility of a modular blockchain, is that's like the future of how crypto goes mainstream, right? If we're going to go mainstream and have in the future billions of users on chain and AI agents and bots and all this stuff, then we're going to need millions and millions of TPS. We're going to need orders and orders of magnitude more throughput than what we have today. And then on top of that, we need to have a developer platform that's flexible enough to implement all the new ideas and not constrain people, whether they're businesses or just startups, on the kinds of ideas that they can explore. Like, the more flexibility that you can give them, the more control and the ability to like customize the full stack of the application they're building, the more powerful apps we're going to be able to build. And we actually have a lot of really good examples of that in our ecosystem.
Yeah, I think that for the people who have smoother brain like me, so I often think that like a smart contract layer is like a color book for kid. So you give them color book, and then you can just color them, and then you get to the finish line really quickly because you can just color them. But
yeah,
Celestia is sort of like giving them just white paper. So, hey, this is a canvas. You can draw whatever you want, but you need to think what you want to draw first, and then you draw later on. So it take a little bit longer time than smart contract layers, I think, to develop. But in the end, you will have a completely different from like any kind of thing from smart contract layers. That's how I see it usually. Like, is that okay to think that way?
I think that's a great analogy. And I try to use as many analogies as possible when explaining this stuff. But yeah, like a coloring book, they already drew the picture for you, and you just have to fill it in. But you can only color between the lines, right? You're not allowed to like completely draw your own
exactly.
thing. And Celestia is like, and you know, for that reason, it's faster. Like, yeah, you can draw the owl and make it look really nice in a less amount of time. But if you're actually a virtuoso, you know, painter like Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci, like, you don't want that shit. You want to be able to draw and build your own thing from scratch. And I think that, you know, our thesis is that even if that's harder and takes longer, the highest quality builders and teams, businesses that are building things on chain, are going to want that control.
Yes.
You know, if you're building just a dummy app or an MVP, just testing something out, I think a smart contract is fine. But as soon as you want to actually go big and really try to innovate or optimize your app, then you're going to need to take the leap to an application-specific blockchain, like a roll-up on Celestia.
Yeah.
So great analogy.
Yeah. Maybe Kyle Samani knock on my door later on, but I think it's okay. So, so now get into the meat of the conversation. Could you explain what Celestia is? Like, hey, what it is, what is the Celestia is?
Yeah, so Celestia is a layer 1 blockchain, right? So it has a validator set. The things that you can, it's much more limited functionality, right? So it's proof of stake. There's a token. You stake the token. You also use the token to pay for gas fees. So you can either send the token around the network, or you can do a special transaction called a pay for blob message, which is basically where you publish data to Celestia for it to be processed. And that action is kind of the same as like sending a transaction on Ethereum L1, for example. That's like kind of the equivalent. So Celestia is an L1 that, you know, if I'm building an application-specific blockchain, rather than me having to spin up an entirely new layer 1, which would be the status quo, but that, you know, that's a huge amount of work, right? Not only coordinating validators, but maintaining the validator set, having to deal with a whole like consensus aspect of my code, potentially issuing a proof of stake token to secure the network, paying ongoing fixed costs of operating all those validators in some way or another. So all this huge cost and time and complexity and just dollars, you get to avoid all that because you can leverage Celestia's consensus layer, Celestia as your L1, and you just post your block data, the data of your application to Celestia. And so a good way to think about what this is similar to is, if anyone in the audience is familiar with cloud computing and how that works.
Yeah.
Obviously, cloud computing is an absolutely huge industry. In fact, huge, like half of the overall market capitalization of Amazon is due to just its cloud business.
Yeah.
So there's similarly like massively valuable cloud components of big tech companies like Microsoft or even Google with Google Cloud. So cloud is like an absolutely massive business in Web 2. And how does it work? Well, it's the same kind of concept where, let's say I'm a startup, I'm Netflix, and I have a bunch, to operate my business, I need to store a ton of data. I need to operate an application for users to browse and select movies, and I need to deliver that data to their device so they can stream, right? So I have all these I have all this I have need for a lot of compute, with storage as well as compute and bandwidth and all this stuff. And I could either build out my own data center with all this servers and things like that, which would be a huge amount of effort. I have to probably buy or rent some massive warehouse, do a physical build out, have a whole team that maintains that, potentially continue to, add more servers as I need to, if I have more users and more overall demands, right? So it's this really complex, ongoing, costly endeavor to build my own data center. So instead, what people do, what Netflix does, is they outsource all of that to Amazon Web Services. So Amazon basically builds a data center, handles all the complexity. They have a team maintaining all the physical hardware, and they add more and more scale and more servers so that you can just, as Netflix, deploy all that stuff on someone else's infrastructure. So it saves you all that effort and headache, so you can just focus on the application. Now, that's enabled by a technology called virtualization, whereby I, as Netflix, can instantiate a virtual server on Amazon Web Services. That's a really good mental model for what Celestia is and what Celestia does. It is like a roll-up is like a virtual blockchain. It's basically, I am, by posting my data, my transaction data to Celestia, I'm able to piggyback off of the infrastructure that Celestia has already built, and therefore save myself a ton of overhead as far as building. I don't have to build my own L1 anymore, but I get all the benefits as if I did build my own L1 in terms of saving costs and time and complexity and stuff. So that's really the way to think of Celestia. It's sort of like this meta blockchain, a blockchain that is built for people who want to build their own application-specific chain. And it just makes that super easy, and it does it in an extremely scalable way. So yeah, that's what Celestia is.
I think that one of the reasons I become a big believer of Celestia was reading after how the internet happened. I think that book actually introduced, sort of explain how the internet actually developed along the way, and then I think that they touch upon 1990s, how all the dot-com bubble happened because everybody wanted to build the data center for their own internet companies, but often most of them actually failed because they couldn't really afford the entire cost. And then and then it's basically the same thing, but I think that it just sort of like hard to convince people. I think at this stage, like, oh, you need to have this thing. But yeah, that's the reason I become a big believer of Celestia, I would say. So the next question.
I love
is,
that. I'm
Yeah.
gonna order that book. I haven't actually read it before.
Yeah,
But
yeah, I mean, because I'm not a coder, so I was like, oh, how can I actually learn how this thing actually happened? And then I noticed that that book actually explained quite well about the history of the internet. That was quite good. Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of lessons to be drawn in the parallels between the development of the internet and the development of Celestia. Like another one, just to sort of riff off of what you were just talking about.
Yeah.
In kind of the way that you also introduce Celestia as like this very simple, minimal architecture. That is actually explicitly one of the goals of Celestia, is to be as minimal as possible.
Yeah.
And that's for a very good reason, which is you want what one of the internet pioneers called a narrow waist protocol. The more narrow and sort of minimal a core protocol is, basically the more like sort of counterintuitively, the more complexity and the better it scales and the more complexity that it enables to flourish on top of it. So like, for example, this was an idea that they used when they were designing the like internet protocol itself, like IP. And essentially the thought was, the smaller and simpler we can make this thing, then the more resilient it will be, the better it will scale. And also the more we should push the complexity and the application logic and stuff to the like spaces that are closer to the user, like on the browser and things like that. And so that there's a very similar like design philosophy behind Celestia itself. And I think in the same way that the internet protocol, now it powers the whole internet, right? The aspiration of Celestia is to be that very core base layer protocol that powers all of Web3.
Yeah. It's such a cool idea, actually. Yeah.